Oh, hi, I didn't see you there. Okay. We'll always give people a few seconds to come on. I would never know what to say, like when we first pop on, because no one is here. But if you're just joining us, welcome to tonight's town hall. My name is Ethan. Yes, I shaved, although it's still undetermined. Please let us know you're here. Say hello. Give us your name, where you're from, and I don't know. Today, should we go with, you know what, we were just talking, let's go with favorite podcast. What's your favorite podcast? That way, not only are we talking about our favorite podcast, but we're helping people find new podcasts. And it doesn't have to be mental health specific podcast. Just what is your favorite podcast? Hey, Carol, welcome. Hi, Kelly. Good to see you, Kelly. I always sound robotic. Hey, how are you? So if you're just joining us, please say hello, name, where you're from, and your favorite podcast. And we will get started in just about 50 seconds. Hey, Valencia. Robert in San Antonio. Does the Alamo have a basement? We don't know. I'm a native Texan, so I can say that. I don't know. Marvel Legends Pod. That sounds awesome. Tomorrow, I guess, Moon Knight, the last episode drops. I'm excited about that. Hey, Carol and Dave, MV, we have a wonderful panel for you this evening on false memories and real event OCD. And we have some amazing guests, as you can see. So we're very excited. Love, Lana. Hi, Mom.
Hi, Liz.
It's your future daughter-in-law, Liz. Favorite podcast is Game of Roses. Witty take on The Bachelor as a reflection of American culture. I would be down for that.
Yeah.
I'd very be down for that. All right, we're 2 minutes past the hour, or at least on the time clock. Conan O'Brien needs a friend. Heather Demick chiming in. Well done. Hi, Heather. Good to see you. Robert, huge collector of figures. Eric Queens. Oh No, Ross and Carrie podcast. These are great. Keep them coming. We'll make a list. All right. So let's get started. My name is Ethan Smith. I'm a national advocate for the International OCD Foundation, which simply means I have OCD, and I'm still talking about it and won't stop until, people are getting treated and stuff. So tonight's town hall is on real event OCD and false memory. This is these are such important topics as they sort of fall within a spectrums of subtypes and symptoms that don't normally get as much of attention as some of the others. So we're really excited to have John and Christina's professional opinion, as well as Reverend Katio Dunn's personal and professional insights into these subject matters. But first, let's get to the housekeeping. This town hall is intended to serve as educational content. It is not intended to replace therapy. For treatment-related questions, please be sure to work with your local provider or contact a local clinician. The International OCD Foundation is not a crisis hotline and should not be used if you're in distress or feel unsafe. If you're in a crisis or ever feeling suicidal or unsafe, please go to your local emergency room, call 911, or call the suicide prevention hotline at 800-273-8255. We also always want to be respectful and kind of others, create as safe a space as possible. This is being recorded on many social media platforms, so always keep that in mind as you talk about personal experience. But again, this always tends to be a very supportive community. We're here to support you. You're here to support us. And so let's all be respectful of everyone's comments. It is Fran. I saw. Hi, Skyla. Skyla would say hi back. It is Fran behind the scenes tonight. Hi, Nikki and Dublin and Deirdre. Good to see all my favorite people. Rachel Binney from the UK. Favorite podcast, Real Life Ghost Stories. I like it. I'm in. Let's jump to some bios so we can jump into our town hall. So first up, we have Christina Orlova. Christina Orlova, founder of KOR Results, is a licensed marriage and family therapist with over a decade of mental health experience around anxiety disorders, over 300 previous clients, and a drive to help others to break the debilitating cycle of OCD. Christina and KOR Results utilize a combination of evidence-based therapies such as CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, ARP, exposure response prevention, and ACT, acceptance commitment therapy, and mindfulness to assist individuals in breaking the cycle of OCD. Christina also hosts the OCD Whisperer podcast, which you can check out on Spotify and other streaming sources. I was pleasure enough to be a guest on Christina's podcast. It is wonderful. And Christina, we are so excited to have you here tonight.
Thank you, Ethan. Excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Next, we have Reverend Katio Dunn. Reverend Katio Dunn is the founder of Faith and Mental Health Integrative Services, an organization helping individuals with OCD and related disorders live into their faith traditions as they navigate evidence-based treatment. Prior to this, she spent 7 years serving as the Academy Chaplain and the Pauline and R.L. Brand Jr., class of 35, chair of religious studies at Woodward Academy in Atlanta, Georgia. While serving in this role, she also served as a consultant on interfaith programming for schools around the country. Katie is proud to be an IOCDF lead advocate, an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, and an endurance athlete tackling 50 ultra marathons for OCD. She is currently pursuing her doctorate at Vanderbilt to continue with her focus on faith and mental health. She graduated from Candler School of Theology at Emory with her Master of Divinity and Certificate of Religion and Health in May 2015. Katie, you have nothing going on in your life.
No, never.
Welcome. Glad you're here.
Thank you.
Yeah, and last but certainly not least, we have John Hirschfield. John Hirschfield is the director of the Center for OCD and Anxiety at Shepherd Pratt. And nobody's ever, is it Towson?
Towson.
50-50 chance.
Ethan, I grew up in Ellicott City. You should know Towson.
Okay. Where he specializes in the treatment of OCD and related disorders in both outpatient and residential settings. He is the author of When a Family Member Has OCD, Overcoming Harm Ocd, and the OCD Workbook for Teens, and co-author of Everyday Mindfulness for OCD and the Mindfulness Workbook for OCD. John is a member of the Scientific and Clinical Advisory Board of the IOCDF and on the faculty of the Behavioral Therapy Training Institute. John is a dear friend of the IOCDFs and like a brother to me. John, how are you?
Doing well, thank you. Happy to be here.
He's taken aback by my kind words, but he's excited to be here. So thank you all for being here. As always, we'll talk for about 30, 45 minutes. But then if you want to ask questions, please feel free to weigh in, say hello. You can also go ahead and load your question in the thread. We go in order. So if you want to get the question in early, and we'll go from there. Also, you'll see some links. Christina's podcast is one. Katio Dunn's link is there as well to her integrative services. So there you go. Let's get into this quickly. Let's just go over some brief layman definitions of what is real event OCD, John.
So real event OCD is a term, like a lot of terms that we use to describe different permutations of OCD, largely kind of came to life through the online OCD community. People with OCD talking to one another, realizing, hey, I seem to have something that actually occurred in my life, and I can't seem to let it go. And I have all of these compulsions, various rituals and strategies, trying to convince myself that it's time to let it go, or I'm able to let it go, or the fact that it exists in my life narrative as a real event is something I'm going to be able to live through and incorporate in my larger story. So in some ways, it's sort of like the OCD equivalent of imagining your memoir and worrying that there's a chapter in it that it really can't be there, and that you're never going to be able to get it out of your memoir. And so it's very similar to existential OCD in that regard. And it comes in a lot of different forms, and we'll probably get to all that today. But I would describe real event OCD essentially as unwanted intrusive thoughts about actual things that actually did happen in your memory, and compulsions being the way that you incorporate that into your reality.
Thank you, John. A great way to put it. I love the memoir analogy. And with that, you did mention memory. We're also discussing false memories today. Christina, can you kind of give us some insight into what are false memories?
Well, with false memory OCD, I think one of the distinguishing factors is that actually it's not something that actually has occurred technically, literally, that you can really recall. And so you could read, for example, or watch a movie or a documentary, let's say, about murder. And then suddenly you might, for a minute, go back in your mind and think, well, wait a minute, I think maybe something like that, or I was around living at a place at a time where maybe something like that happened. And so you start to immediately go into your mind and start to kind of check and review and try to gather evidence because of the amount of uncertainty and doubt that you have. So, or like a client I worked with where, for example, there was just she read an article about how a father abused and molested a child, and that there was some repressed trauma. And then that article became a trigger where then she started to search for evidence to support that within her own family dynamic. And that, well, I think my dad did that, and trying to constantly review and see if there was some inappropriate contact or something like that. So that would be a couple of examples how false memory OCD can show up, and it can feel like a real event, but like I said, a big distinguishing factor is that there really isn't anything that actually has occurred, but it does trigger the same mechanisms like for any OCD subtype.
John, are they often interrelated, the two?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I see people who experience both phenomena. I think it's important to remember that false memories are actually a real thing that happens to people. And so they are thoughts that people have. They get misattributed in the brain as memories. So most of us kind of know what it's like to feel deja vu, for example. I'm certainly not an expert in that, but you walk in somewhere, you're like, oh, I've been here before. And because there's this misfire in the brain that's saying, this experience has been had before, and it feels very real. So false memories are these thoughts that are being misattributed as memories. And when it shows up in OCD, usually what we find there's this confusion of, well, how do I know if this thought is something that I really did experience, or is just an image that popped in my head that is like a random image and isn't really related to me. And so the obsession becomes needing to be certain about the difference between a memory and a so-called false memory. And it's very scary because false memories also do exist.
Thank you, John. And Katie, thank you for being here and willing to share your personal experience with false memories and real event OCD. And I'll kind of open it up to you, what you'd like to share first and how either one or both of those things relates to you and your story.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I'll get into the real event piece later, but I do want to acknowledge the false memory piece for me was such a big part of my OCD journey. And I appreciate what John said, because it took me a long time to get to the point of recognizing that OCD is OCD is OCD. That for me, that was just another subtype of OCD, not some magical type of OCD that made it different from everything else. But for me, there was really this component of grief and trauma and false memories that all came together in a difficult way. My OCD for most of my life actually was kind of about the past, where I would complete something and the question would be, did I do something that was inappropriate? Did I say something inappropriate? And I would try to remember if I did or if I didn't. And the more I would try to bring it into awareness, the more I would see that and say, wait, is that a memory, or was that me just making that up to see if it actually happened? And these were, for the most part, kind of smaller things, but for folks who know my story, my OCD got worse throughout my life, and I didn't get treatment while I was in college or grad school because I was pursuing ordination and was fearful that I wouldn't pass my psych evaluations if I was in treatment. So didn't pursue ERP, didn't pursue treatment, even though I knew that was the case, and started my first role in school chaplaincy, and everything totally exploded, latched onto my students, harm, POCD, anything you could possibly imagine, and started experiencing grief, trauma, and loss in this community where I lost some folks that were very close to me and was caring for a community of 3,500 people with untreated OCD. So experienced a pretty difficult situation where I lost a friend to suicide, but there were a lot of questions around that because of some secretism around the suicide because of stigma within a culture. And started to have these little snippets of, well, what if it was somehow my fault? I don't really know why this happened. What if I said something bad to that person and that's why they made the decision to take their life? And it spiraled until I kept checking for months and months and months, phone records to try to make sure that I hadn't made a phone call, text message records, checking phone data, checking if I went back to certain places. And eventually it shifted from that into this complete assertion that I really didn't know how they died and I must have somehow killed them. And I must be a murderer, and had very tangible things in my mind that did not happen, but was very not convinced. OCD, you always have that little piece of doubt, but there was enough doubt that it made me feel like I was a horrific person that didn't deserve to be on this earth, that didn't deserve to live. So I was playing this double role of treating kids, working with trauma and grief during the day in this very public role, and then going home at night and trying not to call the police on myself for crimes that I hadn't committed. So it was, for me, very much the worst time in my life. And I want folks to know that the false memory piece for me, yeah, it was just OCD, but it felt so incredibly real because of the power that I gave to it over so much time with so many different compulsions that it felt too risky for me to let it go. And thankfully, treatment very much saved my life, but that's a little component of what that looked like for me.
Katie, when did you hear that you weren't alone in false memories, that this was not something completely unique to you?
Yeah. Let's see. So, I was still honestly pretty sick at the beginning of 2019. So I haven't been, it's really interesting how quickly it's gone from that place to a place of doing advocacy and kind of shifting to work in faith and OCD full time. But for me, gosh, this all really started to take place, this particular incident in 2018. And was doing, of course, like everybody else, kind of a lot of Googling. I had a really awesome therapist. Thankfully, at the time, I had just, when the false memory piece popped up, I had just completed ERP treatment for the first time with Shala Nicely, who was like my complete godsend through that whole experience and is now just an amazing mentor in my life post-treatment. But she was someone who turned me on to a bunch of different resources, including, John, your resources, and remember reading and finding out that I wasn't alone, but also that this was a manifestation of OCD. And I'll say the biggest help, in addition to finding out that I wasn't alone, was her absolutely pushing the hell out of me to be as uncomfortable as possible, to really sit with, you know what, this might be your fault. You're never going to know, but it's worth reclaiming your life. And I don't think I would be here without her doing that for me.
It really highlights the difference between being not guilty and being innocent. OCD demands that you prove your innocence, but the court of law doesn't demand that, right? Court of law determines if you're guilty or not guilty. And for most people, they say, well, I don't know what I did. I'm sure I probably didn't do anything. There's certainly not enough evidence to suggest that I did do something. So I guess I'm not guilty. And then I move on. And he says, no, that's not good enough. You need innocence in order to move on from me. That's why it can be such a vicious disorder.
Oh yeah, and Shala always used to say, leave the courtroom. Like, stop having the argument. You're not going to win this argument with OCD. Walk out of the courtroom. But at the time where I was so sick and so kind of latched into that, it felt like, well, what does that mean if I walk out of the courtroom? What does that mean about me as a human being or as a person? How could I go on with my life not having 110% certainty that this wasn't my fault? And that's kind of the trap I think probably so many folks watching fall into, where we're not going to have certainty. But
yeah, we're getting a lot of comments.
Yeah.
We're just getting a lot of comments talking about false memories, and it's literally the worst. And Kelly, I see your comment, and I'm gonna jump in on that in 1 second. Christina, is there, again, OCD is OCD, and we like to say, the content is irrelevant, very much to a certain extent. At the same time, we're always respectful of everyone's content. It's their journey and their place, and that's kind of where we start the treatment. Is there usually more layers to untangle with false memories, just because there's an additional component there of like, well, it's not just something I'm afraid of happened or didn't happen, but I think I remember this. Like, there's
exactly right. I think with both real event and false memory, with either or, right, it's that this is, I think in OCD, right, one of the things when we hear about OCD, we talk about how, it's irrational, intrusive thoughts, images, or feelings that can pop in. And so when you do ERP, you can kind of separate from some of those events. But when you're talking about this, that's just that additional layer of this experience, where it's either something that really did happen, or it's something close enough. And then when you start to search your memory for evidence around it, it's like a copy of a copy of a copy, and it feels like it's kind of distant, but it's still something there. And so that makes it much more difficult to have that healthy kind of separation take place. And then, of course, just like Katie was saying, how could you not assign meaning to that experience? But I remember this, but I remember something that happened, or, well, but I think somebody said this and then I was there, or, right? So those kind of elements make it more complex. And again, though, just like everybody keeps saying, my comment is, I always say, OCD, it's like a sweater. A sweater is a sweater is a sweater, no matter what color, shape, cotton, cashmere, hoodie, zipper, whatever, it's still a sweater, right? So I think the biggest piece, like everybody here has said, is to keep coming back to, even though it feels, right, because OCD is also very feeling driven, it's a very, very taxing emotional experience. So even though it feels very intense and like this is actually happening or happened, and I'm just so sure that it has, and so I have to figure this out, It's still, though, underneath everything, it's tolerating the fact that you, and I think, like John said, you really truly will never have the answer to that question. And so what is it like to step away from that? And that as a concept in general in doing OCD work, as hard as it is, but especially if you have something where you potentially had an experience take place, or having some memory that you think you're actually, like something you're actually remembering, it becomes really difficult to even just sit with that concept and try to embrace it and understand it.
Yeah, and it's a really gnarly, great word. It's a really gnarly 1-2 punch, because you have that memory component, but then the emotional reasoning that you're talking about, which, if I feel it, then it must be true. And so that's a lot of argument. So when, I sit down with John, he's like, let's talk about embracing the uncertainty, and maybe you did, maybe you didn't. It's like, look, I think I remember it. I feel it. I'm told to trust my gut. That's what people tell me. This is what my gut is saying. So like, why should I listen to you?
Right. I mean, yeah, like I said, I had a client where, I have to just highlight this, because we spent hours with this person, because there was so much fighting back and arguing, like, but no, Christina, I remember this, but no, Christina, there's something like this. Of course, for good measure, I talked to family members and I said, look, what's actually going on here, and it was really clear that, like, in this case, this dad, for example, had maybe like not great boundaries, and sometimes joking in ways that maybe weren't always clean and appropriate. But those just personality pieces were just that person, right? But the OCD took those and made those like, well, no, he's a perpetrator. No, he must have done this. Or I think he's doing this to somebody else. And if I don't stop or do something, other people or other kids are going to get, be abused, or something's going to happen. So, how much time is spent on that kind of stuff, right? Because you think you're having some sort of an actual memory of something, but it's, again, your brain is going on a massive hunt trying to find evidence to connect all these dots. And it's really working overtime to try to get that information for you. And yet, like we know with OCD, the harder you try to use logic and rationale, the further away you get from it. The more you get confused, the more anxious you get, right? The more you're kind of consumed by this whole process.
John, I know you have thoughts, and then I'm going to jump to Katie.
Well, just that the thread that connects both of these presentations, real event and false memories, really is often moral scrupulosity or kind of moral harm OCD, because the question is a moral question. Am I allowed to let this go? If I make the decision to stop trying to figure out if this was a false memory or real memory, or I make the decision to just stop going over this thing that happened and say, you know what, it happened, I'm going to now re-immerse myself in the present, live my life. That's a moral decision that I'm making. And if I'm unsure about my moral integrity, who am I to make a moral decision? So you end up stuck in that feedback loop. And I think it's one of the things that really separates this kind of OCD from just depressive rumination, where there might be something in your past that you're unhappy about, a breakup or a negative event, and you're just kind of going over it and over and over again because you have a mood disorder, because you're depressed and your brain just is doing that. And it's sort of automatically playing back the tapes of every terrible thing you ever did in your life because it's immersed in this depressive funk, which is really different. I mean, it can, of course, co-occur with OCD, but it's really different from OCD, where what you're really striving for is this certainty that you have the right to make the moral decision in the first place, and that the decision is indeed the moral one. And so you've been, again, proven innocent. You're now released from the contract of the OCD.
Go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, I mean, just to piggyback on that, I was telling Ethan beforehand, for me, it's always the thing that connects these two is that moral scrupulosity piece, which for me is kind of that relates to my primary core fear, which is, am I a bad person? And I know that's kind of the core fear for a lot of folks. And you're hearing my cat Bonnie, who's affirming now for all of us that I am in fact a bad person. But for me, I mean, kind of flipping, there's that false memory piece, and Christina shared about that too, that it doesn't start off as a memory. It starts off as a what if, that you start putting all of these pieces together that starts to feel like something real. But when I was going through that, I felt like, just like any other type of OCD, if I could just get certainty about this, I would be done with my OCD. I'd be able to move on. I could live a happy life. It would be great. And at that point, I didn't even want to hear false memory and real event OCD associated, because in my mind, that was somehow proving that my false memory was a real event. So folks on here might relate to that too. But my more recent difficult theme, even in recovery, is around real event OCD for very much the same reason that John mentioned, because it goes back to that moral scrupulosity piece, that same core fear of, am I a good person? For me, continuing to ruminate on a difficult divorce and going through over and over again, did I do everything morally right? How could I possibly move on with my life if I didn't? And even though it's not this false memory murderous piece, for me, it's felt just as traumatic, because it's that core fear around moral scrupulosity, around, am I a bad person? Whether it's real event, false memory, whatever that content is, doesn't really matter.
I love that, Katie. Go ahead, John. Actually, I should hand it over to Christina. I usually go to the most furiously nodding guest, and Christina is currently out nodding. Christina's currently out nodding you, John. So I have to turn to Christina for a sec.
I mean, as we're talking about this, so I have OCD myself. Before I even knew about, for example, like I didn't know about relationship OCD. I didn't know about real event OCD. So like, we're having this conversation. I mean, I'm thinking for myself, like personally, how many times, like for me in social situations is where this comes up a lot, and still does. It's not like, it all goes away just because you now understand and, you do treatment, you still get triggered. I mean, that's life. But, social situations, like fear of saying something wrong. And like this for me is an exposure. Or when I'm, socially having some interactions, sometimes I might freeze up and just going to be quiet because it's a way to avoid, right? But there have been times where in social situations, I have kind of put my foot in my mouth and I have actually said something that somebody did get upset. So there's a real event that took place, right? The OCD part is that afterwards, not just for like a little bit, but in a really like unnecessary length of time. And even now, for some things, it's been years and still this little brain will go back again and go, well, but wait a minute, and start to review and replay and rewind. And what could I said, or what happened? Okay, but are they mad? Are they really mad? And have that drive to want to go check or text, hey, how are you doing? Trying to sneak in a little reassurance in there, like we're good, right? So things like that. I mean, that could be on a smaller scale, but of course, the level of intensity, it's different for everybody and depending on the situation. I mean, that's one small example, but that's just something in terms of like a real event, where OCD attaches. We're talking about false memory and how it attaches. And I think just, as you're sharing and talking, it just, again, I think really important to keep noting and saying that whatever the topic, the hot topic of the hour is, right? It's really understanding the principles and how OCD actually works so that you can actually step back for a minute and recognize the overall patterns and kind of the behaviors and go, wait a second, okay, so whether it's real event or false memory or whatever else it is, right, you can start to notice kind of the way that it works and that it really is the same process. And it's literally constantly being unsure. And like you said, that morality piece is huge. This fear of like doing something wrong and being a bad person can be really paralyzing.
Yes, Katie. No, I'm kidding. John.
Ethan, you mentioned emotional reasoning before, and there's some evidence suggesting that people with OCD are somewhat more predisposed to sort of evaluating the authenticity of a memory based on how it feels. How do I know if this is true? Because it feels that way. And if you think about that, it means that there are other ways a person might evaluate whether or not something is true. Like, do I have a picture of it, or is there a physical sensation involved, or something like that? I mean, many people with OCD have the experience of walking away from a locked door that they saw themselves locked, and they have the visual memory of the locked door, but they don't have the sensation that goes with that feeling of having accomplished a task, right? And so they go back to check to replace that. So what happens with a lot of this false memory stuff is you might have a random thought about, what if I was in the other room putting the baby to bed or something like that? What if I did something inappropriate? So kind of traditional harm OCD sort of thought. But the question is the image in my head of me harming the baby, which I would normally say is an obviously OCD thing. I would never do that. But where did that image come from? Well, okay, so it just came from my brain and came from my OCD. I have this active imagination. But how does it feel, right? And if it feels like I did something bad, then I'm going to kind of misattribute both the image of the harmful act and the feeling like I did something bad. And I'm going to say they must be related. And people who don't have OCD, they're less likely to do that. They're going to be like, yeah, I think I would know if I hurt the baby. This is ridiculous, right? My silly brain. They walk away from it because they're allowing other evidence in at the same time, right? They don't get sort of sucked into this mission of like, okay, look, you have the image and the feeling and it must be true, because they're also saying like, and there, there's no screaming baby and there's no history of me doing this. And it's all the facts that normally we kind of pump the brakes with in OCD therapy. Like, don't reassure yourself too much. Don't turn this into a whole project. But people without OCD, the facts just kind of fall out of the sky. They're like, oh, that's enough facts. I'm moving on now. So it's one of the reasons why people get so caught up. And it's one of the problems with terms like false memory OCD, because pretty much any OCD issue that involves uncertainty around whether or not you did the wrong thing, you could call false memory OCD, because it is in some way based on a confusion over, is this an idea or is this a reflection on something I really did?
That's so interesting, John. Well, first of all, Christina, I totally relate to. In fact, some of the things, if I had to point out a few things that my head still gets really busy at, it's definitely like worrying I said something, especially around work. Things I'm very value driven. Like, oh my God, what did I say in that text? What did I say in that phone call? Did I say the right thing? What if I said the wrong thing? Like, I think I still get very, not to a dysfunctional point, but like my head gets busy where I have to be like, yeah, I'm a terrible person. I said all the wrong things. Let's keep moving forward now. But what's interesting, John, to your point, is like, as I started talking with Katie about, false memories and things like that, I started like immediately going, oh my God, I think I had false memories, and becoming like really reflective about this period of time. Not that it's important, because it doesn't change anything about how I would move forward, but it is interesting to your point, because, my whole thing sort of at its worst was specifically centered around hitting my head and creating a brain bleed. And I remember so many times, and I mean, I remember so many times where, there was a day where I sat on the couch for probably 36 hours because I'd gone to the grocery store, forced myself to get out, took the groceries out of the trunk, pulled the trunk down, and I couldn't remember if I hit my head as I pulled the trunk onto my head, if I'd hit it or not. And I mean, like, not only, so first of all, like, I went for proof, like feeling, touch, where the groceries are, where the car, but then I started to have intrusive thoughts, but the intrusive thoughts were back there. So I remembered myself, I kept seeing myself hit my head. So, which then was like, well, I must have done that because the feeling was uncomfortable around that. And then the anxiety shot up, and then the panic went, and then it just kind of all becomes its major thing. Now, whether it was a false memory or not, I don't know, but it was an intrusive thought that tied itself to the event. And then the emotions really just carried it the rest of the way. And for me, that would happen daily. I'd have new false memory or intrusive thought about me hitting my head in different ways. I would remember it. I could see it happen. But the difference is I had that little piece of uncertainty, that little piece of like, you didn't, Ethan, but it was such a quiet piece compared to the OCD that was just screaming at me like, you're going to die. Don't listen to that 2%. Listen to me. Go ahead, John. You're about to say something.
Well, I mean, you're referring to an obsession about something that you're really not sure in the moment if it happened, and you're worried that there's going to be a future physical consequence. You may have injured your head. There's a related obsession. I think some of the viewers might connect with this, where the obsession is about what could have happened. So an event occurs, like maybe, like in your case, like sort of opening the trunk, and then maybe you do bump your head a little bit. But then you have this like other memory or false memory that shows up after the fact and says that something else happened that was even worse, that could have happened. So we've all been in situations where, maybe you looked away from when you're driving, you look away from the road for a second and you start to veer into the other lane and you go, whoops, we've all sort of caught ourselves making a little mistake. And then you have this thought of, well, what if I hadn't caught myself? And then you start to play this event over and over and over again. And the concern isn't, did I get into a car crash and die? The concern is more like, am I allowed to let this idea go? I could have gotten in a car crash and died. I could have killed other people. How much do I need to play this over and over in my head as a kind of punishment for my, not being careful enough? And so that's a sort of related obsession. It's not exactly false memory, but it's this obsession about, well, like what could have had happened.
It's so interesting that you said that, John, and then I want to turn to Katie. It's so interesting that you said that because, and I'll out myself here, Katie and I were driving to do something with our engagement rings or whatever, and we left, and we were on a one-way street that had 2 lanes, and I was in the right lane, and I was planning to make a right, but then my GPS said to make a left. So I was like, oh, I'll make a left. I looked in front of me, no cars were coming, and so I made left. And like all of a sudden I hear all these horns and all this stuff, and like I look behind me, and he's like, Ethan, that was a one-way street. What were you doing? And I was like, oh my God. I didn't think much of it at the time, but for 2 days straight, I kept and I didn't even tell you this, Katie. I was like, should I drive again? Like, is it like, am I getting to it? Is the medication, like, why did I do that? I'd never done that before. Is it unsafe for me to drive? And I started like going down that rabbit hole a little bit of like, and then I was just like, you know what, you're just gonna, and I put it away and didn't go down that rabbit hole. But totally, like I spent a couple of days kind of like playing with this notion of maybe I should give up driving. Maybe it's unsafe. I almost killed, the woman that I love. What do I do with that? So it's
interesting. And there was a real event there, which was the beginning of a tragedy, but it didn't actually go all the way.
No, but because the possibility was there, then it's like, well, I can't risk it in the future, so I shall never drive again. Katie, we have, we can go as long as we want. I'm going to get to some questions for sure.
Well, can I say one thing before we get to questions?
No, sorry. I'm coming to you. I'm coming to you now.
No, but can I? Well, okay. Well, ask me what you're going to ask me.
Go ahead. I don't want to sleep on the couch tonight. Go ahead.
That's a real event.
Oh my gosh. We're not usually on town halls together. So no, I just wanted to bring up too, I loved, John, what you were saying. And for me, it's actually been helpful. And I know the false memory term is really helpful in folks finding each other. It was for me early on, but for me, it's been really helpful to frame it as intrusive thoughts about the past or OCD about a past event, rather than putting kind of that memory title on it. And thinking, I told kind of my big one that lasted for a long time, but for other viewers who might be listening, I'll say some of my first experiences as an adult with OCD that first put me in a place of really deciding I needed to get treatment were things as small as I would write a birthday card and seal the envelope, and 20 seconds later say, do I remember writing something inappropriate in that birthday card? Do I remember writing something derogatory in that birthday card? And as a chaplain at the time who was literally writing 70 birthday cards a day, this became a whole thing where I would have to take multiple pictures of every birthday card because I couldn't trust my memory that I hadn't written something bad. And it was the same thing, Christina, to your point, pretty much every person I walked by. Did I say something derogatory? Did I cuss at that person? And even getting to the point that as a chaplain, I would visit little classes of students and I would get back to my office and I would think, what if I accidentally hit a kid? What if I hit somebody? And what if I just don't remember it? So I got to the point, made up crazy excuses to email every teacher after I visited a class to say, hey, did everybody have a good time? And if they emailed me back and said yes, I'd be like, okay, I guess I didn't hit anybody. Guess we're good. We're fine. But for me, it was very much all these little things were just like we might have OCD about a future event, just OCD about the past, questioning what I did, what I didn't do. And the more I would continue to question, the bigger it would get.
You might even have a clear image in your head of the, perverted thing that you wrote on the card, even though that didn't happen, because you start to worry that it could have happened, your brain will create a sort of cartoon version of the event. And that's where the false memory stuff comes in, because, well, is that just a thought that my OC added after the fact because I'm really worried about putting something in the card? Or is that a memory of something I put in the card and now I need to go and check and open up the envelope again?
Oh yeah, and it feels real. And then, for folks, the taking pictures piece, which I know a lot of folks do as compulsions, wouldn't be helpful either, because it would be the same thing. I would look at that picture and then 10 seconds later, well, did I look at it right? And is that really what it says? Can I trust what it says? Is that okay? So,
well, no, you're fine. I just recently talked about when I was afraid I overdosed on Tylenol and I could see myself taking the Tylenol, I went back, I count the pills, went back, count the pills again. Eventually 6 hours later, I took the Tylenol and I put it in a plastic baggie and I taped it to the front of the wall so I could see it from my bed. So anytime I freaked out, I would look and I could see the Tylenol. But even then I was questioning what I was seeing and am I seeing it right? And is it more, is it less? It's no end in sight, except the uncertainty, folks. I want to get to questions, but first I'd love to spend a little time, because Katie, you're such a beautiful example of, where you've come from, where you are now. Obviously, there's still things going on for both of us, but what if you had to throw out 2 or 3 things that really helped you sort of move out of that place of paralyzation with your false memory component, that it was around a real event, and you've moved into, following your values. What are some things, because a lot of people are talking about their own false memories and real event OCD. So what are some things that have really worked for you?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest things, and it's funny, I posted about that on Instagram this morning, actually, because it was helpful for me, and it's something you taught me, Ethan, which was I'm willing to risk all of the scary things coming true for a chance at the life that I want and that I desire and that I deserve. And that was such a tough pill for me to swallow for such a long time, because it felt like, how could I possibly risk this? And what does that mean about me as a person? But it was really in taking that turn that I was able to actually reclaim my life and say, yep, you know what? I am willing to actually risk this because my life is worth it. I care enough about this life that I could have. So I think that's one piece. Another piece for me is the self-compassion piece, actually beginning to acknowledge that I did deserve a big, beautiful life. I hated myself for so long. And I still struggle with the confidence piece with some real event stuff. I still struggle with, am I good enough? Do I deserve to live this happy life? But I think for so many of us, that's so big to recognize you are worth it and you are worth getting better. You are worth risking everything in this treatment to have this life. And then the final piece for me, the third that was really significant was probably, and I'm sure I'll think of more, but that for me, learning that the only thing that was actually certain was that if I continued to do what I was doing with my false memories, I was going to continue to get sicker and continue to go down that rabbit hole. That was the only thing certain, that I had a chance by leaning into the uncertainty of reclaiming life. So those were kind of my big turning point pieces.
A couple questions, a couple minutes, and then we'll jump into questions here. So if you've got questions, go ahead and load them in. There aren't too many, so I think we can jump to all of them. Actually, Christina, now I feel guilty. John, or should I sit with the discomfort of the guiltiness? I don't know. It's all confusing. It's Katie. I'm just skipping it. I'm avoiding it altogether. No, I'm just a mess tonight. Don't mind me. Christina, piggybacking on Katie, what are in terms of false memory, what are some things that really benefit your patients to sort of tackle and focus on as they focus on sort of their false memory aspects of their OCD?
I mean, of course, I think like with everything, we're always going to hear exposure response prevention. I think the other piece is what you also mentioned, that compassion component. And I think the other bigger piece is when I do the work and I have them do the OCD symptom log so that we can start to look at patterns. So I start to really teach them how to kind of step back a little bit and go a little more macro so that they can recognize what are some of the common threads. Like a big common thread you might notice is, every time I feel uncertain, I want to escape or avoid this. So, and that comes from a little bit of the acceptance commitment therapy. So really, really kind of getting at that, because underneath all of that, that's really kind of the heart of the OCD experience. And so, also recognizing and separating from the fact that, we're meaning-making machines. We want to make meaning out of everything, right? And that not everything has meaning and that all our thoughts or ideas are worthy, right? How many ideas do you have throughout your life? And how many of those ideas are actually things you put in action or actually something comes out of it, right? So kind of teaching them how to separate those things. And then through, of course, practicing to actually connect, practicing to actually engage in behaviors that are actually in alignment with what they truly want and how they want to show up in their life and in the world, really following those versus their OCD. And so when we shift the conversation into that, that really helps folks start to design some exercises and start to actually practice some of the stuff and create some of that separation over time.
And John, in terms of real event, we're still talking exposure response prevention, acceptance commitment therapy, which is the approach. But for real event, how do we combat John, but it really happened. You can't refute that. It really happened. I did it. So how do we can't move past it because I really did it.
Yeah, cool story, bro. What do you want from me? Why did you come to therapy? If that's going to be the approach, right? What is it that you want from the treatment? What is your goal, right? I mean, I'm joking, of course, but it really does, to a large extent, come down to in cases like these, the response prevention is the exposure, right? Because as I said before, it feels like a moral issue to stop checking, or to stop avoiding the things that bring on these memories, or of course to label and abandon rumination as a compulsion. Those feel like moral decisions. So those are the exposures. I think sometimes we get a little bit too caught up, especially with obsessions about real events, with exposure to this idea of like, yeah, I really embarrassed myself. I'm a terrible human being. Everybody hates me, or I did the wrong thing, and it's going to be a mark on my record forever. I'm never going to get over it. Some people respond really well to that because they kind of burn out that circuit and they go like, yeah, that's the story, and I don't need to listen to the story anymore. But some people don't respond as well to that, and they get kind of wrapped up in the story, and they get more and more unhappy with themselves because, as it turns out, self-compassion is kind of the exposure, right? Who am I to offer myself an objective viewpoint when the subjective viewpoint is so much more painful and I probably deserve more pain? So I really like the idea that you have a choice between telling yourself, I should have known better, which I think is based on a lot of confusion about what leads us to make decisions, including decisions that don't work out for us, versus what would be helpful now. Because if you can focus on what would be helpful now, the answer is always going to be something better than a compulsion. It might be exposure therapy, or it might be just dropping it and doing something fun, or it might be distracting yourself or something like that. But it's always going to be focused on how to help yourself make a difference, how to sort of change this loop that you're stuck in. But if the focus is on, I should have known better, the OC is always going to hold that over your head, unless you really take a look at that and are really able to recognize that whole concept of I should have known. I mean, what's the first thing we teach people in OCD therapy? That should is a cognitive distortion. Mm-hmm. When it comes to I should have known better, we seem to make an exception. And I think we need to not make that exception.
I love that. So let's jump into some questions. John, I'll stick with you. Rachel Binney at 7 or 9 p.m. asked, does OCD exist without anxiety? Anxiety-free OCD. I feel like that's diet OCD, but it may exist. I don't know, John.
It depends what you mean by anxiety. There's a lot of OCD that's entirely disgust-driven, for example, and people who experience disgust-based OCD will often report that they don't feel anxiety, but they feel some other kind of internal distress that they find intolerable and will do whatever it takes to get away from. Normally when we're describing the obsessive compulsive cycle to people, we use the word distress as opposed to anxiety because it can manifest in people in different ways. And the compulsions reinforce that relief from that distress. And so it's the same process, whether you're actually anxious or not.
Thanks, John. I'm gonna actually go fairly quick, but because I want to get to everybody's and some good ones on false memory. Not that I'm judging people's comments, like some are good, some are bad. That is, maybe I am. We don't know. At 7 or 9 p.m., Robert asked, Christine, I'm gonna throw this at you. Is it normal to have urges on acting, harm, OCD, evil thoughts that caused huge dread yesterday? So, is it normal to feel like I'm going to act on my harm thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's part of OCD, that it can be also kind of classified under like impulse. A lot of times folks with OCD can have this fear that they're going to impulsively act on their thoughts or act on their compulsion. So that definitely comes up in all sorts of different ways. And again, right, we want to come back to tolerating not knowing, to tolerating that uncertainty that, well, I don't know, maybe today will be the day. Maybe this time I might do it. Maybe I won't. I don't know. Let's see what happens.
Thank you, Christina. Kelly has some good thoughts on, and I hope you're doing well, Kelly. It's good to see you. Kelly has some good thoughts on false memory. A couple things, but the first one, I'm gonna throw this to Katie. 7:17 p.m. I've been dealing with OCD, especially false memory harm, for 20 years, and even with prevalent social media info out there, the past couple years still see false memory harm killing so rarely. Her 7:18 p.m. comment is this because it's the scariest thing to admit in public? Where do you think the disconnect lies in talking about? I remember you saying, Katie, that one of the first thing you saw on false memories was John's blog article. Mm-hmm. On it. Like, where do you think the lack of conversation is? Where's that coming from?
Yeah, and there definitely might be more perspectives from the clinical side, but just anecdotally, I do think these are themes that are scary to talk about, and I'm so appreciative that harm and taboo thoughts are talked about more frequently now, and that is something that we recognize. But I don't know. I think especially with the false memory piece, and not to give this power, because again, it's just OCD. It's not anything different than OCD. But sometimes I think there's this real stigma around saying, yeah, well, my OCD theme is about, I'm worried that I'm a murderer. Let's say that at the dinner party. That sounds kind of scary, right? So I do think that it's something maybe scary to talk about. It's scary sometimes to put out there on social media, but I would say that it is being talked about significantly more. If you're paying attention to conversations happening on Instagram, on Twitter, it is something that is very much out there, and I think is becoming destigmatized.
John or Christina, you want to weigh in?
I mean, I just want to say that with social media in general and a lot of things that are out there, it's really easy to also get very triggered. I also think about cases and clients where like the Me Too movement, right? Or other stories coming out around, let's say like rape. And then especially like male clients, in my case, I will say, oftentimes looking back at, prior situations or being in college or other places and thinking, oh my gosh, and especially if substances are involved, like, did I actually do something? I don't know. I can't recall, but I think, and so just paying attention, I think, as well to how social media and just knowing your own triggers, right? What actually is triggering for you. And then, of course, conversations like that can be difficult to have, right? Because who's going to want to sit there and say, oh my gosh, I think I might have maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe I raped somebody, right? That's an extremely difficult pill to swallow and to have that notion. So, when we kind of put all those pieces together, I think it makes sense in that context, right? So I think, again, just understanding your own OCD and your triggers, and whenever you're not sure, hopefully you have some resource of working with a specialist or somebody that you can kind of unpack this. But I think, if you don't, then absolutely, it definitely is, if we think about just society at large, there's a lot of conversations in general. Most people will judge and most people will have some sort of, shaming reaction. So we do, I think all of us in the world generally tend to be really kind of more thoughtful about what we're actually going to disclose or discuss.
Great point, Christina. John, you're slightly nodding. I'll give you 3 seconds.
Well, if we understand the basic concept that thoughts are normal events that arise in consciousness, that we're not the authors of these thoughts arise and we observe them and then we respond to them, then it would also make sense that some thoughts we're going to be conditioned by the outside world to have automatic responses to. So most people might have see a difference between having a thought about a fluffy pillow and having a thought about a knife. And they're going to have a reaction like, oh, a knife popped in my head. That feels different from just something nice. And that's all well and good. But if you have OCD and then you're responding to that initial thought with like, oh, I don't like that thought. And then you add layers of shame. I'm a person who has those thoughts. And you forget I didn't choose to have that thought. That thought chose me. Well, you've already forgotten that because you have OCD. So now you're worried about what are you going to do about being a terrible person who has these types of thoughts. So then when those thoughts come back, because again, they're normal thoughts, they're supposed to come back, you're now tagging them with additional information. This is the bad thought because I'm a bad person. I have to do compulsions to get away from it. And so the loop gets stronger and stronger. And that's why we call it a disorder. This is a very long-winded way of saying there's a reason why we have to continue to work on stigma around taboo thoughts, because we're not going to see it reflected in the public as much, because we don't even reflect it inward that much as something that's okay, because we are scared of these thoughts, because it's at some level normal to be conditioned to find some thoughts unpleasant. It's just that when you have OCD, you add these layers to it that make them problematic as opposed to just unpleasant.
I remember when I was in treatment at the very beginning, for those of you who know Dr. John Hoffman, I know you both do. He's a very smart man. And as we were walking down the street one day, I was worrying about thoughts. And he says, I didn't ask to be in charge of 6 billion neurons. No one asked me if I wanted that responsibility, but here I am. And so, it was very funny, him kind of just playing this like, why should I be responsible for all 6 billion? I didn't ask for this. So, I'm just not going to pay attention. It was kind of just reminded me of kind of what you were alluding to, John.
Yeah, Dr. Jim Claiborne once wrote on the one of the OCD support groups, what goes on in my mind is none of my business.
Yeah. So great Johns think alike. At 719, we touched on this a little bit. What is an example of an exposure that would help with real event OCD? We kind of talked about different approaches. I don't know, John, if you're comfortable kind of alluding to, I know it's kind of hard without something specific, but if you want to.
Well, so I would want to look at what are the behaviors that you're doing differently to try to get certainty that it's okay to leave the real event behind, or that whatever the real event means about you as a person is something that you're willing to live with. And so I'd look at those behaviors. what are we going to see? A lot of rumination, probably a lot of checking. There's probably going to be certain avoidance behaviors, things that maybe movies that you don't want to watch because they might bring up that subject matter, or maybe there's just certain activities or people that you're not allowing yourself to be around because it triggers the memories of those thoughts. And as long as we're not talking about a real traumatic event where there might not be some sort of added value benefit to purposely putting yourself in these triggering situations, and we are talking about OCD, then I would sort of look at, well, okay, if we had already skipped ahead and you were better, how would you be behaving? And then we start to behave that way and maybe add a little. And so this is where I think optimism becomes very important, because the tendency when we're doing exposure therapy is to think I'm not allowed to have reassurance and I must be pessimistic all the time. And uncertainty acceptance is telling myself I'm probably bad. But top shelf uncertainty acceptance is behaving as if you're probably okay. That's the scary thing to do. And so presenting yourself, doing exposures that actually add value to your life and actually feel good with this stuff is very often the biggest exposure. And then I would work on a lot of mindfulness and act-based things for really just recognizing rumination as a compulsion, seeing it where it is, dropping it on the floor, moving forward.
Thank you, John. Katie.
Yeah, no, I'm just speaking to this from a personal space at everything that John said, and even what you said previously about kind of that false memory and real event piece and some differences around exposures really resonates with me. Everybody, of course, is different, but in the personal space, did a ton of scripting and all kinds of different stuff around that specific to the false memory and saying, this may or may not be true, thinking about that in extreme detail. And that was really, really effective for me once I was able to nail down the response prevention, which is always kind of the hard part to get in there. But with the real event piece, and again, been a little transparent about this tonight. This is a more current thing for me. I get really looped into being a minister who went through a difficult divorce a couple years ago. And what does that mean about me morally? And go in these loops around going through every event over and over to make sure I'm a good person. Was I bad? Did I do anything wrong? And for me, the scripting hasn't been nearly as effective with that, because that's really been about reliving events that I don't necessarily want to relive and reliving trauma where what John is saying, while it's really difficult, has been more effective when I'm able to do that, which is just offering myself compassion, saying, you're here in this moment. How do you want to move forward with your life? How can you offer yourself compassion that you deserve to have this big, beautiful life, regardless of whether or not you made good or bad decisions? And it's, for me, it must become kind of this act piece of the exposure in and of itself, like John said, is just living my life and saying, you know what, I'm going to live the best life I can possibly live. I'm going to allow myself to experience joy. And that has become kind of the ERP in and of itself.
I love that. Thank you for sharing, Katie. I keep calling you. I always look at the first name and I always call you Rev every time. So that'd be weird. I actually have a lot of thoughts on this, but I want to get to some more questions, and then if we have time. Valerie Andrews at 7:29 p.m. How are you doing these days? Fran, if you could put that up, I'd appreciate it. It's just a great question. And yep, great. I'm good, Val. Thank you for asking. Okay, as we go on, Melissa at 7:32 p.m. says, how do you effectively do ERP for moral harm OCD? I should give up comedy. It's really bad tonight. I'm sorry, folks. I don't feel relief from exposure, just guilt. I'm hurting them with my mere presence. Sucks. Am I missing something in the process? John.
So I mean, without understanding the specifics, we're talking about moral harm OCD. So the idea is that you harmed someone in some way as a reflection of doing something immoral. So again, I think that brings back the question of, how are you assessing the morality of what you did? And are you doing it through the lens of self-punishment or through the lens of objectivity? If you look at all of the experiences you had and all of the thoughts and feelings that, again, you didn't choose, that led up to that moment that you did whatever it is that you did, and now you're feeling guilty about it. Will there ever be enough punishment? Will there ever be enough to satisfy the OCD? Probably not, right? So usually when I'm hearing like long-standing moral harm OCD and the guilt is just pervasive, it's going on long, I'd want to take a look at depression, just depression on its own, free from the OCD, to see if that's kind of acting as OCD's little like henchman to keep you down, keep you from fighting the OCD. So I see that sometimes where people are doing, certain types of exposure, and just seems to be making them worse and worse and worse, and they're not habituating at all. It's because it's driving another mechanism in their brain that's actually keeping them from looking at things the way they really are. So without more specifics, I wouldn't want to get into much more than that. But the thought of guilt that you're hurting someone just with your presence, I mean, that's an idea, that's a thought, that's a theory. It's not something you could test or know to be true. So there's got to be something that you're doing in the moment that you're around people and that thought comes up and you're somehow validating it with a certain response. If you could catch that thought and not validate it, and just be like, yeah, okay, that's just how I think, you might find it a lot easier to be around people.
I also wonder if, and John made a good point of saying if you've been doing ERP for a long time and you're not experiencing, but like the feel and relief really caught my eyes in terms of like if you're doing exposures, going into them to feel a sense of relief after doing an exposure or get that satiating sense of this is going to go away, which, we would love, but if we gauged how we were doing in ERP therapy based on a feeling, well, we never feel victorious because it feels awful a lot of the time, especially in the beginning. So, I would, again, to John's point, we don't necessarily know your specific situation, but if it is something where, every time you do an exposure, you look for a sense of relief or something to get better a few days after, I would consider the fact that it's a marathon, it's not a sprint, and there's going to be many days of ick, and it's really, the feelings come, but at the end of the day, it's more about the actions and being willing to accept the uncertainty of being, hurting people with your presence. Let's go hurt some folks. Let's go being my presence as many places as possible, and kind of, I call it an uncertainty blanket. I just visualize a big blanket to wrap myself under, and that's how I'm going to approach this, and I'm not going to know. And I don't know, Christina, if you have any additional thoughts before I continue.
Everything you said, I mean, that's kind of to come back to kind of foundational principles. It's two things, right? Like you said, one, it's not that you're looking for relief. It's that you're looking to actually get better at facing and feeling discomfort. And two is the principle of willingness in all of this, right? Am I willing to have this uncomfortable experience? Am I willing to just not quite know the answer to this? Can I leave this kind of question mark looming over my head and go for it anyways? And again, it's kind of switching into that frame and mindset, and then going ahead and starting with something small even. And I think the last piece that I would want to be aware of is if and when I am doing some of my ERP exercises, am I in any way compulsing? Sometimes, we can sneak in compulsions from small little ones to big ones. So you want to kind of check yourself. Am I in any way compulsing? Am I in any way justifying why it's okay or why I should avoid this on some level? So I think I'm doing an exposure, but really I'm kind of secretly, maybe avoiding the actual experience. I'm mentally kind of telling myself, well, but I think I really am actually, hurting them with my presence. Or maybe I think I did ERP, but then right after I went and I somehow compulsed, either it's mentally or physically. So those are the kind of things you want to look for. And then, of course, to be effective is, prolonged over time. Like it's it's a muscle, right? Like every muscle in the body, you have to keep putting a demand on it so that it can grow and get stronger. So you do have to practice over time.
Yeah. Plus,
Christina,
Melissa, just want to say, Melissa, your presence isn't hurting any of us. So, just don't assume that the OCD knows what it's talking about.
Well said, John. I love that. And Christina, let me point this at you. At 7:33 p.m., Elizabeth asks, what about extreme embarrassment? Is that a common OCD emotion associated with making mistakes?
Oh, definitely. I think so. I mean, it definitely, I think, connects with social anxiety, but definitely with OCD, 100%, right? Especially if you have a fear of making mistakes. You absolutely, that can be a debilitating feeling. Like John was saying earlier, right? With OCD, it's not just anxiety. It can really be, it's kind of the spectrum of any of the negative emotional states that we all don't want to feel, whether it's guilt, embarrassment, shame, disgust, anxiety, any of those. So embarrassment definitely can be one of them.
Thank you, Christina. Heather wrote, so you have moral scrupulosity about yourself, Ethan. Yes, that was the reason I constantly sought medical attention, was I didn't want the world to be without me. So I felt it was a moral responsibility to seek help to make sure that the world had me for as long as possible.
I actually have to note, pretty much all of Ethan's obsessions are about himself, but I knew he officially cared and loved me when he had his first obsession about me, and my heart was so filled. He had an obsession that something horrible.
It was a beautiful moment. I was worried about something. I was worried about something happening to her, and I was like, "What's going on?" It was very touching. We'll never forget that night. Peach at 7:35 p.m. asked, "My daughter jumped off a tree branch because her thought were telling her to. She also jumped off an electric scooter because her thoughts. She got hurt. How can I help her?" I'll toss this to John.
Well, that's really scary as a parent, obviously. And so obviously the first thing is to make sure that your daughter is getting seen by a professional. It could be any number of reasons why a young person responds to an intrusive thought, and only one of them is OCD. So occasionally we'll see people do things that are poorly thought out or unwise or even potentially dangerous when they're having intrusive thoughts, and in order to make sure in their mind that they're not going to do the bad thing, they see how close they can get to the bad thing to check. And then sometimes, that checking can get to an extreme level where you're actually putting yourself in danger. And so that's one way in which it might be OCD. Responding to a thought, very quickly, and then, engaging in action that could be harmful sounds more impulsive than compulsive. So I'd want to know what was going on. Psychiatrically speaking, is there another condition that might explain why your daughter's having some difficulty controlling her impulses? There's not much more I can say in this venue, but I definitely encourage her to encourage you to get your daughter an evaluation to make sure you get the diagnosis right. And then if it is OCD, treat the OCD by dealing with, teaching her how to deal with not knowing if the bad thing is going to happen and not checking to see if it will happen, or recognizing that urges like images, like thoughts are just, things that arise in the mind and you don't need to pay them that much attention. And if this is driven by some other process, then there's going to be another treatment for that to help keep your daughter safe.
Thank you, John. Katie, I'm going to throw this to you at 7:37 p.m. Kelly asks, "I have false memories that feel 100% real within a second or even in the moment. Is that normal for OCD?" That's probably why 2 psychiatrists have said my insight is so low it borders delusion.
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely let John and Christina speak to that from a clinical perspective, but I'll say that, for me early on, there were things that, it was just, this is a what if, right? But the further I got into my OCD and into actually giving value to intrusive thoughts, there were definitely things that came on incredibly quickly that felt like, oh my goodness, this almost feels 100% real. This feels like I just couldn't possibly let this go. And I think those are moments like you talked about where insight gets to be really, really low. I think generally, and John, you can speak to this with OCD, there's still at least that little tiny bit of like, well, maybe not, maybe not. But I think it can get to a point where it feels like it's almost real and it feels really irresponsible to even question it. John, I don't know if you have any, John or Christina.
We all show up in different ways,
Yeah.
People have different levels of insight. A lot of times the higher the anxiety goes, the lower the insight goes. So things seem, it's like that the car mirror, things seem closer than they are closer than they seem, something like that. So if it's the case that 2 psychiatrists have said, the insight is low and it borders on delusion, okay, right? I mean, you can still work with that. Like if you have some awareness that you have these thoughts and that when things you would rather not do seem terribly like things you just did, well, you can use that awareness of like, okay, well, I tend to have these delusions or low insight bursts or whatever you want to call them, and walk yourself out of continuing to investigate them and figure them out, because you will certainly make them worse by over evaluating them. So I would come up with a system for saying like, yeah, I'm going to call that OCD and move forward and not spend too much time on it. Even if the issue is that it's like feels very real, come up with a mechanism for like, what, if it's about stabbing people, it's not for me, just kind of, if it's in that content area, then I'm going to take the risk of living my life and I'll wait for a knock on the door. I won't wait for a knock on the door, please. I'll be busy. I won't even be there. I'll be at work.
The lived experience that I can talk on this, Kelly, is that, I was diagnosed by the time I reached a really good it's a really good therapist, 17 years after being diagnosed and 31 years, I was told I had a very high OVI, overvalued ideation. So essentially very low insight. And my belief in my obsessive thoughts was so strong that they oftentimes trumped or muted the healthy thoughts that were like, this is not, Ethan, you know what really happened. I think one of the things that I learned as I went through this process, especially when I went to a psychiatric hospital, was I learned how to choose my words carefully and to reflect, because I think I specifically, and I've noticed this in a lot of individuals with OCD, we have a tendency to use very big, strong words, all or nothing words, in fact. So, I would say to the psychiatrist who later diagnosed me as psychotic, I would say, I'm going to do this. I know it 100%. There's no doubt in my mind. What I was really saying is, oh my God, I hope this doesn't happen. I don't want this to happen. What if I do it? I'm scared. And I didn't have enough insight to realize all that at the time. But in reflection, I was really talking in these absolutes, when in reality, I was exhibiting doubt. I just wasn't verbalizing doubt, right? So it's like this idea of looking inward, and this concept of like wise mind, this DBT concept of wise mind, where you start to listen and reflect and start to see if you can notice some other things, other thoughts happening, some of these healthy non-OCD noise that is saying, if you can see, even to John said, 99% is not 100%. So if you've got 1% to work with, you can pull on that thread and start to like loosen the knot, right? So for me, reflecting on sort of how I was feeling and how I was verbalizing my truth, both to myself and other people, really started to help me kind of loosen up. Because when I would say, as opposed to like, no, it's going to happen, I'm like, well, I'm afraid it's going to happen. It feels really real and I'm not sure, but like, so that, I know that helped me.
And I also,
go ahead, Christina.
Go ahead, Christina.
Well, I just wanted to jump in about the feeling piece, because I think that's such a big part of the experience. And when it feels 100% real, because you are actually having a real visceral reaction, right? Like that is part of the brain that's getting triggered. So you are having physical, symptoms, right? So when things feel that real, and then, we think about how often do we use our feelings as a barometer, right? Like we'll say, oh, I feel kind of good about going to this event, or, oh, that doesn't feel right? We often do use our feeling sense with that. So when you're having something that pops in and it, you're having the feeling getting activated, and then you're using that to kind of guide you. We have to kind of slow all of that down and again, step back and kind of look at that again and start to learn and recognize kind of what I typically say and see in my clinical practice is, what is that familiar state that OCD puts you in? Because there really is a certain kind of state you get into it, and kind of how it feels in your body, right? For everybody, it's a little different, but it's usually either like your stomach is twirling. Like for me, it usually personally, you can feel like somebody's literally like putting their hand in my heart. It's just like, like it's wrenching, and I'm like, oh my God. So, even in those moments, because you have OCD, you're going to adapt, but I don't know, this time though, this feels different, right? This time it feels different. It feels like something else. But even then, right, just coming back to connecting to your body, connecting to that feeling, to that state, and being able to kind of engage that self-talk to say, I'm not sure right now, right? But am I willing again to just kind of be in this experience for a little bit and give it some time and just see what happens, so that you kind of disengage a little bit. So I just wanted to speak to the feeling piece, because it's such a big, massive part, obviously, of this whole experience. And it is, normal.
Thank you, Christina. And I see all of your questions, and I'm going to try to answer some questions from answer. Wow,
Sorry.
We'll get to
this is. Can I add one more thing to Kelly, because it's just kind of like chewing away at me.
Yeah. Or should you sit with the discomfort? Go ahead, John. It's fine.
Well, I should sit with the discomfort right now. Well, it's just, we're saying like to some extent, just call it OCD. And I saw that she had posted in the comments that she was told never call it OCD. That's reassurance. And I just think it's important as a message for everybody. Maybe I'll get in trouble for this or something, but like, you need to break the rules sometimes in order to get better. And sometimes, especially if you have additional circumstances that make your OCD particularly sticky or like difficult to treat, and insight might be one of those reasons. Or if you have a co-occurring condition that makes it more difficult for you to address these things, you just have to fire hose them away sometimes. You just have to be like, I'm not dealing with that. You just have to, okay, that's my OCD. Right? Like, I don't generally teach people to go around labeling every thought an OCD thought or a non-OCD thought. Like, you can definitely get into a lot of trouble with that. That's not necessary. Thoughts are thoughts are thoughts. but you have to also do what works. And if you keep doing something that isn't working because someone told you to do something in a certain way, well, it becomes compulsive, right? The treatment can become compulsive. And so sometimes you have to break the rules a little bit to be an individual with OCD.
I love that, John. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to get to some individuals that haven't had a question answer yet. 7:57 p.m. Valencia asks, how can I get past the idea that God is going to get me all the time? It's like he is sitting somewhere waiting to get me. Is this religious OCD? Katie's nodding hardest. Katie, go ahead. You're on mute, Katie.
Sorry, the cats were making noise. So the religious group piece I know is something I work with often, and I hear this almost every day from folks. So Valencia, first, just to let you know that you are absolutely not alone in this aspect, and this is definitely something that could be called religious OCD, because you're having a particular obsession around God, around your faith in a way that's extreme. And a lot of times when we think about what healthy faith is versus OCD being kind of latched onto faith, we think about fear and obligation as kind of this OCD component, but healthy faith being a space where you're finding joy or where you're finding meaning. And it sounds to me like what you're kind of engaging in, I don't know what the religious practice side looks like, but is that you're feeling like, oh, God's going to get me. I'm in fear in some way. I'm fearing God. I'm feeling like I have to do something in this particular way. Whereas the non-OCD piece would be, well, I just want to engage with my religious practice because it brings me meaning, because it brings me joy. So I think definitely the best practice with this would be to engage with a professional who can work with you in exposure and response prevention to do some specific exposures around this. And I'll also go ahead and give a nice plug for our OCD and Faith Conference on Monday, May 9th, coming up this Monday, where we're going to be talking about all of these different things and how religious obsessions might look across different faith traditions, and giving resources to faith leaders, individuals with OCD, and clinicians. So Valencia, this might be a great place for you to come and get some support and also learn a little bit from others who might be experiencing the same thing.
Thank you, Katie. 7:39 p.m. I'm going to go backwards. Thanks all for discussing. I'm struggling with real event OCD and obsessing over what I perceive to be resulting deformity that others have told me is not. Any advice? Christine, I'll throw this to you.
So I'm just rereading that. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, for sure. No, take your time.
Right. I mean, I think pretty much really everything that we've been discussing here in terms of advice with this. I mean, again, right, the biggest thing with any and all OCD experiences is this place of uncertainty, right? And here you're saying, perceived to be resulting deformity that others have told me is not. So if I'm understanding correctly, meaning others told you that things are actually okay, but you keep getting stuck on something. And if that is the case, then, I mean, a couple of things. One is, that's part of how real event OCD and really any OCD works, is that even if, let's say, you did something, anything, that you're perceiving as bad or negative. And even if, let's say, you did check with other people, or you just are trying to recall that event and everybody told you, oh my God, it wasn't a big deal, or you didn't really do that. Part of what I always tell folks is step back for a second and kind of look at what are the other people doing? Are they moving on? Are they doing the next kind of set of activities, tasks, and so on? And what are you doing, right? Because that's what OCD does for us. It really has us pause and completely not be able to move on to the next set of tasks. So you get stuck kind of in a loop. You start to want to maybe, mentally review or recheck or go seek reassurance again, or ask again about the event, or if there's any pictures from the event, you might want to go relook at those pictures and maybe reconnect to each person individually. I mean, with OCD, we can start to go to great lengths to try to seek and get that certainty, right? To make sure that really things are not bad, everything is okay. And of course, as we know, OCD doesn't respond to logic and rationale. So I think the main thing to really look at this is, even if a real event took place, again, are you willing to have those questions that are in your mind unanswered? Are you willing to allow them to just kind of hang out there like a cloud over your head that can just be there and just take it with you throughout the day as you move along, so you can actually practice engaging in behaviors that probably people around you are engaging in? Because otherwise, like an example I can give is, somebody I was working with where it got stuck on, because there was a class on chemicals and BPAs and all that. I got stuck on, this must be then in my college cafeteria. So now I'm showering 5 times a day, wiping, Cloroxing, cleaning, right? And we had to kind of stop and look, say, hold on a second, because we can forget kind of what is kind of appropriate or normative behavior that we want to engage in. And so we had to look at, well, what are your classmates doing who are in that class? And classmates are going to the cafeteria and they're eating food and moving on with their day, right? And what are you doing because of your OCD? So that's a piece to kind of, you could probably or potentially use to help you differentiate between, what is something that I actually do want to do, right? Sometimes I do have people look to their peers and look at what are they doing? Are they already on to the next whatever event or doing other things? And if that's the case, you want to kind of model some of those behaviors, because, OCD loves nothing more than to rob us of being able to actually feel free and actually live our life.
Thank you, Christina. I appreciate that. I want to read MV's comment at 7:45. It's just great insight in sort of their experience. False memory is my hardest theme to go through. My brain creates so many horrific images that I obsess over. It targets my students and my brother the most. I will get thoughts that I've done sexual things, and I compulsively review everything until I can't tell what really happened anymore. I know in the back of my mind that nothing happened, but the what if is so scary and shameful. Having self-compassion for myself is so hard. It's a beautiful, I'm sorry you go through that. I wanted to read it because it really is just a beautiful encapsulation of sort of everything that sort of we've been through, and I know so many have, in terms of, and as Katie is a teacher, I'm sure can relate as well. So thank you for sharing that. And self-compassion. Yeah, go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, this resonates so deeply, and MB, thank you for sharing that. And I just, the self-compassion piece, I know is so hard, and it's something on the personal level, again, that I struggled with for so long. It was like, how can I possibly have compassion for myself when I'm having these thoughts and when I'm worried about these events of the past? And just want you to hear that, again, your OCD is latching on to these things because they're the most significant to you, because you love your students, because you love your brother. And it doesn't make it any less challenging, but you do deserve to move forward and live a big, beautiful, awesome life. And I think sometimes with things like this, at least for me, I used to kind of, without even knowing it, almost self-sabotage and moving through ERP. And that was a big piece that my therapist and I had to work on. I would do the exposures and almost intentionally not engage in some aspects of response prevention, because I felt like I didn't deserve to get better. I don't deserve to live this beautiful life. So I'm going to continue to engage in compulsions to make sure I can't, just in case I'm actually this horrible person who did these acts, right? And I just want you to hear that you do deserve to fully immerse yourself in exposure and response prevention, because you do deserve this big, beautiful life with your students, with your brother, with everybody you care about. And I bet the world deserves to have you back in full too. So I'm just sorry for what you're experiencing, and I hope you give yourself permission to get better.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, well said. We're just about out of time. Rachel, I see your question. Shoot me an email and I will answer you. I just found a question last question I wanted to hit on, and I just lost it. I apologize. 2 seconds. There we are. 8:11 and by the way, thank you for all the great conversation. Always great insight and collaboration and advocacy within the comment thread. So y'all are awesome. And going back, John, to the daughter, the younger girl, Peach's daughter. Peach later wrote, been diagnosed with OCD. She's 10 years old, just to add some additional insight into sort of what she's going through. At 8:11 p.m., Busad asked, how can I do ERP for real events OCD, which link directly to other OCD, harm OCD, and fear of getting mad? I'm reading it too. Anybody can.
I mean, I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but what I could say is that it's very common to become somewhat phobic of emotions in OCD. And if you have Harm OCD and you have an association with thinking, if I get mad, I might lose control and hurt somebody, you might be compulsively trying to avoid situations where anger could arise. So one thing you can do about that is get a Twitter account, and then you'll be angry all the time. And do exposure to the things that set you off, and but in all seriousness, like do things that allow you to experience a level of anger that you can tolerate. And when you're in that experience and your OCD comes in and says, "Oh, you're angry, you're going to lose, you're going to do something bad," reestablish a more playful relationship with that OCD. Don't go on defense. Be like, yeah, sure, anything can happen. Yeah, well, what's next? I mean, that's the sort of central thesis to a lot of this stuff. Even
I was just about to say that.
Previous comments were saying about compulsively reviewing these false memories because maybe I did something bad, et cetera, et cetera. And it's that behavior, that choice that we make. It's kind of like looking at your email inbox and seeing something that's really obviously spam. It's not something you would normally get, and not just tagging it spam or ignoring it, but opening it up and replying to it and say, well, sure, I'd like to know why you want to put $6 million in my bank account, et cetera, et cetera. But what that does is it changes the algorithm. So now the system thinks it's supposed to keep putting those messages in your urgent email inbox instead of spam where it belongs. So you want to think about, how am I responding to this thought in such a way that's teaching the algorithm that I want it in the inbox as opposed to I want it to go straight to spam. And you could probably apply that to many different OCD scenarios.
Well said, John. Very well said, as always. Let's give some final thoughts. I'll come back around to John. Let's start with Katie. Final thoughts.
Oh gosh, I wasn't ready for final thoughts. Okay, so I think I'll kind of leave it with what I was sharing just a second ago. For folks that are listening and for folks that are struggling, I always like to say I remember watching these streams. I even remember listening to John on OCD stories or reading things about false memories when I was really in a place of struggle. And I remember hearing folks talk and thinking, I'll never get better. That'll never be me. Mine's different. Mine must be real. Mine must actually be bad. I'm different from all of these other people. And I always like folks to hear, you're different in that you're special, but your OCD isn't different. And by engaging in everything we're talking about tonight, by engaging in exposure and response prevention, by really leaning into that discomfort and sitting with the uncertainty, you can get better. You will get better. And despite what your intrusive thoughts are telling you across the board of real event or false memory, you deserve to get better. So allow yourself to get better because the world deserves you.
Thank you, Katie. Katie. Christina.
Yeah, I think what I want to say is really two things. One is, if you're not sure you have OCD, please make sure that you do seek out a specialist and that you really get the proper evaluation and diagnosis. It literally can be life-changing just to know that that's actually what's going on and that there is treatment, and kind of start to help you make sense of just the world and yourself and your thoughts and feelings and actions. And lastly is that all of the stuff that is talked about and on any OCD form, right? The main thing, like anything in life, and I always say this, is it just takes time and practice. That's all it is. And if you're willing to dedicate some time of your life to learning and practicing, 100%, something's going to be different, right? Something's going to change. You're not going to stay in the exact same place. And I think it's worth it. So I hope that, whoever's listening out there, that you guys do, make that commitment and, and fight for, whatever is most meaningful for you, whether it's your freedom, getting your life back, being better connection in your relationships, whatever it is, but that's just so much more worth it than continuing to give in to your compulsions.
I love that, Christina. I always John Grayson always talks about, what are you losing? I always think about that. Like, what are you giving up by choosing the compulsion and not the value? Make it specific for yourself, because that's really what helped me. John, final thoughts.
I haven't found trying to be as good a person as my OCD wants me to be to have paid off. So don't be afraid to do your second best. That's the message I think we should leave here. It's you're probably doing a better job of being a person than you think, and you can kind of adjust the scale appropriately. I don't think I could outdo it, what Katie said about the world deserves you. Live as if that's true. Don't wait for confirmation.
Beautifully said, John. And lastly, I actually want to give some credit here to she was on Heather Demick is she's behind the scenes. Well, she's actually commenting. She's the director of communications at the IOCDF, and is a lot of the reasons we're doing such the amazing programming that we're doing. She was on the thread commenting, but she rarely gets some praise, so she deserves some praise as we are a better foundation organization because of the work Heather does. So thank you, Heather, for always supporting and joining the conversation. We appreciate you. Don't go away, because I always have things to talk about, whether they make me or not. I'm just always talking. Quickly, tomorrow, tune in for a brand new Ask the Experts. Ask the Experts stream with advocates Dr. Liz McAmill and Chris Tronson. You can ask questions live or submit them at iocdf.org/peace of mind. Registration is open for the annual IOCDF Research Symposium in July. We invite researchers, students to share data and findings from their latest OCD and related disorders research. This year's symposium will be a hybrid in-person online event. You can learn more and register at iocdf.org/symposium. I'm going to Google symposium right now. It's a new word. Registration is open for 27th Annual OCD Conference. First live conference since 2019. It's taking place in Denver this July. Special event is for the entire OCD and related disorders community, including individuals, families, supporters, therapists, researchers. You can learn more at iocdf.org/OCDCon. Christina, are you going?
Not the live one. So my mom, I don't know, most people know, but she has cancer, so we're still kind of dealing with that. So I don't, not that one. Okay. But I'll be at the virtual one.
Awesome. Well, we all want to see you there in Denver. We're all super excited, and our love and support to your mom, Christina, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. The IOCDF's Faith and OCD Conference, which Katie spoke about, is happening May 9th. It's just around the corner. Online conferences for faith members, faith leaders, and mental health professionals. You can get more info at iocdf.org/faith conference. I hope you guys don't pay by the domain URL, because there's a lot of stuff here. Join us for 1 million steps per OCD walk this June and October. That would be 2 months of walking. That's one more month than I usually like to walk. But find a walk near you and register today at iocdf.org/walk for a day of community advocacy and fun. As always, I want to thank the IOCDF and Fran behind the scenes for keeping the lights on. That's my trade line for this year. It's not that great. This live stream is one of many. You can see the entire schedule and submit questions and suggestions for future streams at iocdf.org/peace of mind. You can also view recordings. I know a couple people are asking if it was going to be on after. Yes, recordings of past live streams on IOCDF's YouTube channel, iocdf.com/IOCDF, and as well as Facebook. And I don't know, does Twitch record and save? Definitely Facebook and YouTube. To be notified of when we're going live, follow the ICDF on social media and subscribe on YouTube and Facebook, as well as Twitch. You'll get a notification. It'll be like Ethan's talking, and you can roll your eyes or come. Either way, there it is. Like and subscribe. And as always, if you need resources, please visit iocdf.org. Thank you all so much for spending your Tuesday evening with us for this really wonderful conversation, this necessary conversation around Real Event and false memory OCD. Sometimes I get in trouble for this. I don't know. But if you have questions that didn't get answered, if you have a question for John, Christina, or Katie, please don't hesitate to email the IOCDF at info@iocdf.org. I always forget if we're supposed to do this or not. Whatever. And please ask the question. Just let us know it's for one of these three amazing human beings, and we'll make sure that they get the question and get you an answer to your question. So don't hesitate if we didn't get to your question. I think that wraps up everything. And thank you, of course, to John, Christina, and Katie for taking your time and bringing your expertise and personal experiences to this town hall. I know everyone appreciated it as much as we do. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, have a wonderful day. Stay safe, stay vigilant, feel the feels. Don't let OCD off the hook. And tomorrow and then Tuesday is another community conversations with me, just Ethan. So Tuesday, tune in. All right, have a beautiful evening. Good night.
Monday. Faith Conference Monday.
Sorry, your throat. We couldn't hear you. You were a little hoarse. Bye.
Bye.